Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Voices of Change. I'm your host, Tex Wambui, here today, and today we are honored to be joined by someone whose work speaks to the root of environmental justice, literally. So, this episode is going to explore the legacy of colonialism in global agriculture and environmental systems through the lens of Assam's tea industry. And we'll unpack how cultural heritage, indigenous knowledge, and climate justice intersect and what it means to reclaim land not only as territory, but as memory, resistance, and healing. So today, the guest is Shreya Chaudhuri, is a recent UC Berkeley graduate with a degrees in environmental science and geography and minor in global poverty and practice in data science. She is the founder of Project Planet, a 501c3 nonprofit advancing decolonial environmental education, which has reached 67,000 people globally and directly impacted over 3,500 students across 20 countries. And at Berkeley, Shreya created and taught the course Decolonizing Environmentalism, co-founded the Decolonial Environmental Network, and served as a climate action fellow for UC System. And also, we are fellows for the YCLC. Her honors thesis, Equi-Tea, explored indigenous ecological knowledge on her family's ancestral tea farm in Assam, inspired by her ancestor Harish Bagachi, who reclaimed land from the British. She is now launching a farmer-to-consumer tea brand and cafe with Judith Lee Stronach Prize, and Shreya has spoken at the Pioneers Conference, UN Academic Impact, and most recently, she was the UC Berkeley 2025 commencement speaker. So, with her interdisciplinary background in scientific research, grassroots activism, policy and education, and communication, Shreya envisions an environmental future rooted once again in reciprocity, justice, and love. Shreya, welcome, welcome. And we are very, very thankful to have you joining us to show here today. I know I did a whole long spiel introduction, but I want to now give you the platform, kind of telling us a bit about your journey and what brought you to environmental justice through the lens of geography, family history, and tea.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm very excited to explore more of these intersections. And yeah, so a little bit about what drew me to this field was a lot of it was rooted in my family, but it was also in sort of being adjacent to a lot of climate disasters. Like while I was very privileged to not directly be impacted by them, I did like fly over cyclones that like ravished a lot of the villages I grew up around. I was also like next to a lot of the wildfires here in California, and combined with like all of these natural disasters happening in the world and the lack of equity in solving these natural disasters was kind of what drew me into this work. And I mean, I was really tiny when I entered. I was like at 11 years old in sixth grade. So it's been quite a journey. And initially, it was mostly just focused on trying to help climate change through an academic or a scientific lens. But after learning more about the structural issues that inhibit a lot of the climate solutions from being impacted equitably, that's kind of what drew me to exploring more interdisciplinary lens. And it also made me understand how personal this fight is to so many communities and how important it is to restore Indigenous knowledge systems globally as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Shreya. And it's also really just a pleasure to also be in the same cohort with you for the YCLC. Um, and it was really great experience getting to meet you and getting to meet all the other people in LA beginning of this year. And your project begins at the intersection of traditional ecological knowledge and
Mhm.
colonial industrialism. So how do you see tea, something many people view like as an ordinary, right, as a symbol of both historical trauma and ecological wisdom?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I I think it's such a complex history because it is really it is in so many ways the perfect symbol of colonization. Wild tea is native to Assam, but it was never cultivated or grown at the scale that the British enforced. They completely changed the geography of Assam because it used to be the most forested state in India, but they cut down so many rainforests to the point where when you drive in Assam, there's just miles and miles of plantations, essentially. And beyond that, beyond just changing the ecology, they changed the people of that region and the communities there. They enforced a system of indentured servitude and labor. And because the indigenous people of Assam, they resisted the forced labor system because they were able to kind of use their own farming methods, and they didn't they didn't want to be in that system. So instead they kind of tricked a bunch of other communities in India, and then they brought them promising a false dream of like freedom and all of that, and then they brought them to Assam to work on these lands, and then they weren't able to escape, and they were treated really badly. And so that's kind of the history of tea, but then also it's complex because within my own family history, my great great grandfather, Harish Bakshi, he was one of the first tea planters or tea farmers of Eastern India. And he bought land back from the British, and then he erased indentured servitude, and he created a different economy that wasn't built on extractivism and wasn't built on forced labor. And instead, he allowed for the ecologies to heal and for the communities to heal. And so even though they were still selling tea, they were selling it in a way that honored the autonomy of that region, of that community. So it's kind of a dual-edged sword where, yes, the origin of it is rooted in colonization, and today there's that history continues in different forms. But like there are so many farmers in that region, so many workers in that region who are trying to reclaim that history of tea for ourselves, even though there is so much pain and trauma in that region. And it's also interesting how that legacy of tea is synonymous to so many regions of the world. It's also like English breakfast tea, for example, is not English, of course. It's made up of Assam tea, Sri Lankan tea, and Kenyan tea. So it's this really, it's this product of empire, essentially. And that invisibilization of global supply chains continues today with corporatization, with neocolonial policies for international trade. And right now, my family, who are small tea farmers, they're fighting corporate tea plantations that are trying to take over their land. And on corporate tea plantations, there is like so much human trafficking. There's a lot of sex slavery, and that that it really shows how colonial legacies have never been erased fully. It just continues with a different name, in a different story, in a different cycle. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's a bit about
Yeah.
the background.
Yeah, I'm really actually glad you brought it. You brought the fact about Kenyan tea as well. Proud Kenyan myself, and I actually grew up, went to school next to a lot of those tea farms. So
Oh my gosh.
I definitely do
Crazy.
enjoy myself a cup of tea.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very nice, very nice.
Yes.
I even though I drink coffee sometimes, I find myself wanting to drink tea as much as I can. But just kind of build off of what you said, like what does your family's sixth generation legacy in Assam's tea industry kind of teach us about the ways land, carries both cultural and colonial memory?
Hmm. Yeah. There's Wow. Oh my gosh. There's so many ways to kind of, I guess, think about that because there's like one angle, which is all the history and trauma that's kind of been buried in the land. And now we're seeing the impacts of it because there's some tea trees, their lifespan can be up to a century, like 80 to 100 years. So the tea trees that I go to visit when I visit my family in Assam are the same tea trees that my great grandfather planted. And at that time, the tea industry wasn't at the state that it is now because they were still like, even though there was rampant colonization in India as a whole, that land that my great grandfather reclaimed, it was still owned by my family and they weren't being as interfered by external forces as they are today. So in some ways, they were less bonded to the land than they are today. Um, so even though at that time it wasn't as bad, we're seeing the impact of that legacy of monocropping today. So those trees that are planted, they're dying and their soil is degrading, they're depleting, and all the pesticides that have since been introduced with the introduction of the Green Revolution in India, we're seeing the impacts of all of that with the high cancer rates in the community. We're seeing like workers spray pesticides without any like protective equipment. And there's a lot of impacts on the community that hasn't even been studied yet, right? Um, and so there is that manifestation of history on our land that's coming up in a lot of traumatic ways. But also there's a legacy of reciprocity with the land and engaging with the land in ways that I personally didn't know because I assumed that because tea was an enforced crop on us, it was a cash crop and a blood crop, and it was cultivated in a way that wasn't traditionally practiced before. I didn't realize that we would have such a connection with tea, like through traditional practices. And I was talking with my aunt about this recently, and she was like, yeah, like we use the leaves to make pakoras, like these fritters in the winter. And a lot of the tribal communities, they use the tea to make a kind of curry traditionally. And there is a lot of knowledge with the tea, with these cultural practices of tea that aren't in the same way that was enforced on us, but was, used by the community that I started learning about. And there's always been such a connection that I guess a lot of the neocolonial forces are afraid of because they're afraid of that bond that farmers and workers have with the land, and that's exactly what they're trying to stop by buying up our land. And so there is a huge push in not just Assam but in India and also honestly across the global South and in so many countries around the world, right? About honoring our traditional ways, about honoring our traditional lifestyles, and archiving the knowledge that we have been using for centuries, if not millennium. Um, and so a lot of the people that I was meeting with, whether they be like scientists or farm workers or like, my own family members, they have been advocating for the resurgence of Indigenous science in our community and in implementing that. And that I think gives a lot of hope in how we're trying to restore our connection with the land and repair these bonds that have especially been obliterated with forces like the Green Revolution in recent years.
Wow, that's deep. You really delved deep into that, and I also did some research on you just to you know kind of talk about this in Stepped in Time. You emphasize that
Oh my gosh.
restoration is more than reforestation. It's about relationships, narratives, and stewardships. What have you learned about how indigenous agroecology differs from conventional models of sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's like its very basis is completely separate from industrial agriculture because it's not about profit. It's not about, okay, how much are we exporting? It's not talking about land in numbers. It's talking about land in relationships and in memory and in reciprocity. So inherently there is that distinction where one is rooted in extraction and the other is talking about how much we are receiving from the earth and how it is our duty to reciprocate that relationship. Um, and I think that, especially in terms of industrial agriculture, it is necessary to return to these indigenous lifeways because our food is being poisoned, and we ourselves do not have access. on the whole in the world for most people do not have access to land where we can grow our own food on. And without that access, there is control over people because like there's that quote by Vandana Shiva, when you control food, you control people. And it's interesting because for example in Assam the land has it's all tea plantations. There is no food that grows in Assam. And like you can grow it on your in like your family farms or whatever in a small quantity, but there's nothing else that grows in Assam except for tea. All food that my family eats, that's shipped from other parts of India, which doesn't make any sense because Assam is one of the most fertile places in the world. So I think that it is imperative that we return to indigenous agriculture because we're poisoning our communities by relying on industrial agriculture.
Wow. Okay. That's great to just hear you expand on that and talk about that. Now, kind of transitioning to this kind of next part of our conversation. Um, let's talk about Equi-Tea, right? The title of your project translates to Liberation of the Land is the Liberation of Her People. Can you kind of walk us through the vision behind the project and how you're weaving together, research, cooperative economics, and decolonial food systems? Because something that I think about when it comes to this is, specifically like for the continent of Africa, everybody thinks it's this whole revolution for fintech, but part of me is also thinking about the aspect of, food tech. So can you kind
Mhm.
of walk us through that vision behind that project?
Yeah, so equity was originally my thesis for Berkeley, and then now it's kind of taken on a new life through a fellowship, which is going to be about creating a farmer to consumer tea brand and supporting agroforestry projects in the region. Um, and oh my gosh, wait, sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, can you just walk through like how you're weaving together research, cooperative economics, and decolonial food systems?
Mhm. Yeah. So I think that in any kind of project that works with the community, it's necessary to rely on a lot of different approaches. And so, yeah, there was, of course, the scientific aspect of it on researching agroforestry in the region, because a lot of that knowledge has been intentionally lost and intentionally separated from the community. So, one aspect that I was focusing on mostly last year was about researching what kinds of indigenous knowledge systems have existed in Assam and what kinds of crops that we grow that would work with tea so that there is both a diversified income for farmers and also it supports the soil health and soil regeneration by not just having monocrops, and it would boost the health of the entire farm as well. And I think for that approach, for the scientific angle of it, it was important to frame indigenous knowledge as a science because it has been practiced over centuries and over millennium and from people that have been tied to that land for generations. And so although it isn't practiced necessarily in the same ways and same tools and language as Western science, it is still considered a valid science form. And it's also something that isn't just traditional. It can be evolving, it can change, it can grow. So that's why I was trying to focus more on the term indigenous science as opposed to like traditional ecological knowledge, which are both pretty similar but a little different. And then in terms of the economic aspect of it, um, we wanted to work with the community and the small family farms specifically. And there's such a high demand for tea in the West, especially in Berkeley. Like there's a boba shop every block, and every single boba shop has Assam black tea. And after speaking with a couple of these stores, I didn't think that they were getting them from the sources that are providing good quality tea, but also ethical, fair trade tea that values both the community, the people that are growing it, and also the land itself. So that's kind of where the idea for spearheading a farmer to consumer tea brand came from, because there we wanted to really bridge the demand in the West with the communities in the East, and how can we create a system that is rebuilding the local economy of Assam without really exporting our profits to a corporation that is stealing from our community, using our labor, but not providing that income, and that extra income that will be created through that brand will go to support those agroforestry projects that are already in place, because it is expensive and there is a lack of government support in Assam for the farmers in that region. um, and then also within this entire project, it was important to engage with a decolonial framework, because most of the research that has taken place in Assam, it was completely through a Western lens, and it really extracted from our communities. And some of the resources that I was looking at from the archives, like from the Bancroft Library archives in Berkeley, for example, I was seeing books from the 1700s that were like drawing pictures of indentured laborers, and it was through this completely colonial lens that was viewing the people and the land as something to extract from. And so it was important to address those histories, because without talking about colonization, you can't talk about environmentalism. It's completely tied together. So yeah, those three aspects really created the framework for the project, and I'm really excited to continue it into next year.
Wow, the idea of a farmer to consumer tea brand rooted in justice is very powerful. And navigating the complexities of ethical production, narrative ownership, and global markets is also something that's very powerful. And here at the Voices of Change, first we'd just like to commend you by saying you are a voice of change for your respective community and for yourself. So kind of the question I have is, what role does um, archival storytelling play in the process of land liberation? And how are you preserving and sharing Indigenous knowledge in a way that resists extraction and commodification?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what is included in the archive, because a lot of the archives that I was going through at Berkeley or at different libraries here in the Bay Area or even online, they were talking about the history of tea as something that was beneficial to the community, as if we didn't have a previous economy. And that narrative is still present in Assam. Like there was a huge plaque in front of one of my family's farm that was saying celebrating 200 years of tea in Assam. And like there's this narrative in Assam itself that is valuing the British for introducing tea to us, because without tea, we wouldn't have survived in Assam. And that aspect of storytelling comes directly from the archives, because the British were the ones who preserved the archives. They were the ones who established the universities. They were the ones who wrote the history books. And so when you have that power and that control over a community through language and through owning our history, that influences what decisions are made and what the community thinks is good for us. So, in order to change that dominant framework and narrative that has a lasting impact globally, it's important to change the archives themselves, and therefore change what we value as a society, because you only value what you only archive what you value and what you deem is important of passing down to the next generation. So if we're including things that have typically been excluded, like, for example, my aunt's stories about what kinds of trees grow more during monsoon, right? That's not ever included in the archive. So if we have that in the archive, or if we have stories from experiences of indentured laborers in that time, like if we include those kinds of stories in the archives, we reframe history itself and we get to tell our own stories. So that's why it was really important to include archiving as a method of research and framing this project, because the archives are essentially where all that knowledge is stored, and oftentimes the knowledge of Indigenous communities are excluded from that narrative. But yeah. I'm grateful to be able to still be connected with my family and with the communities that hold this knowledge because I know for so many people it's it's been lost. So we're trying to protect what little we have, and especially because it is mostly oral. So writing that down and creating it in a way that isn't distorting what they're saying. So having that grip over language and translation is equally important.
Wow, that's very true. You know, where there's history, there's progress, and there's also
Hmm.
room for understanding. And the aspect of ownership is vital to, you know, telling the story of geographical location. Um,
For sure.
You know, and now kind of transitioning to our next part of our conversation, kind of around youth systems and global movement building. You know, you
Hmm.
founded organizations like the Decolonial Environmental Network and Project Planet and led education initiatives like Decal on decolonizing environmentalism. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions young people have about environmental justice and how can we reframe it?
One of the reasons why I created the class Decolonizing Environmentalism and then also my nonprofit, sort of based on that class to promote more decolonial environmental education was because there was a complete lack of it at Berkeley. There was only one class called Environmental Justice. And even then, there are so many narratives that are excluded from it. Like, let's say it's only focused on America or it's only focused on the lens of the colonizer. So there was a lot of stories that I feel like I was hearing from my family that was excluded from environmental programming on campus. And it felt like environmental justice was an afterthought or a footnote, something that could be included because it's nice to include it, but it never felt like it was central to environmental education, not just at Berkeley, but like through growing up, like anywhere that I saw environmental justice, it felt like it was always an addition rather than something to be centered around. Um, and I think that within that kind of a narrative, it feels as though environmental injustice is always present in the same communities, right? It's always present in communities of color, in low income communities, in frontline communities. And there is never a critical dissection of why that is the case because it promotes this idea that communities of color are naturally poor. We're naturally more prone to natural disasters. And that's just not true. There is a systemic inequity, there is a history of oppression that comes with it. And that puts a lack of agency to our communities by not focusing on the histories that have created this injustice. So that's why our course, Decolonizing Environmentalism, focused a lot about that history of colonization and capitalism and how they have brutalized communities globally. And it was this intentional system. It didn't happen accidentally. That oh no, like it just happens that all of the communities that are suffering the most from climate change happen to be communities of color. There was a systemic process that enabled this and is causing this inequity to this day. So I think that that's one of the greatest misconceptions that I've been witnessing across a lot of spaces that are well intentioned, but without including more environmentalists of color, I feel like that narrative gap about climate justice being focused in tragedy will always remain. Because I feel like as an environmentalist of color, I have seen the resilience in my community and the things that we are doing to help combat this. And that puts a lot of agency back into our hands. But instead, if there's always that narrative that there is inequity, there is injustice without critically approaching why there is so, we don't really feel like there is a lot of pathways towards the future. It feels that it will always be inevitable to have this inequity. So I think that it's really important to move away from the tragedy framework and to honor the knowledge systems that have been a part of these communities for generations, but have been intentionally delegitimized in favor of Western education.
Well, that's fairly well said. And a question I actually do have about something you said, you know, what does solidarity look like between communities in Assam and communities of color here in the United States or anywhere across the world also facing environmental violence?
Mhm. Yeah, there's so many similarities to the structures of oppression and colonization and um I mean, so many examples, right? Whether we're talking about farm workers here, or there's actually an example when I was doing my research that I read about a connection like between the system of colonization in India and in the American South. And there's this one specific story that really stood out to me was how some of the colonizers used babies as crocodile bait. And they did the same thing in the American South as they did in, I think it was in Tamil Nadu or in, it was a lot of different states in India that they did this in. But they, I forget who, like which colonizer started it, but they learned from each other. And so there was that, like, that system, the same system of oppression, essentially, whether we're talking about plantations, whether we're talking about indentured labor, about slavery, about neocolonization, about green revolution. And there's all these similar pathways globally. So if the colonizers have learned from each other, I think it's important for like communities of color that have faced this for centuries to unite instead of divide, which is exactly what that system of colonization has tried to enforce, right? Like divide and rule. So we have to avoid that because we are the global majority, and it's about time that we connect and unite because there's objectively more of us.
Wow, I just learned something new about the whole babies for crocodile bait. I
It's
did not know that.
crazy,
Yeah, that is insane. Um,
disgusting.
wow. So if you could reimagine environmental education from the ground up, what would it look like, and who would you see or vision leading it?
Hmm. I think that um that it would always mean there's going to be a collective of communities as opposed to one specific person or like a couple of different people. There needs to be a different system of solidarity, of unity, and I don't know what that necessarily might look like, but I think if there is, you know, if each local community has their own organizing around environmental justice or environmental justice education, and there's representatives from those communities that are meeting in the context of a global stage, I think that that would really allow for local communities to learn from each other and connect from each other. But it also puts the platform on each individual community as well to share their own experiences and to share their stories as well. Um, and specifically in terms of environmental justice education, I think that there's so much happening in the world that is like scarily similar to each other. And I think that, you know, for example, with tea, right, like bringing it back to that, there's communities all around the world that are growing tea and that have been growing tea in an unsustainable way because of its colonial roots. So if there was a way to learn from each other because I'm sure that there's things that are working in one region that aren't working in another region, and vice versa. So if we are able to connect and learn from each other, that would be the dream to be able to rebuild environmental justice.
Yeah, that is something that I would like to echo as well from what you just said. I really like that because
Hmm.
one of the things that we do here at Voices of Change is wetlands restoration,
Hmm.
specifically the Mongol wetland in Limuru, Kenya. And our goal is to restore the place to kind of change the habits of the people of ensuring that the specific wetland does not degrade. And also for the fact that biodiversity there, it's one of the places in the world where you can see rare bird species come there to habitate with each other. So we're taking that lead of ensuring that we can kind of clean up the area because it is a groundwater conservation site. So it's a place that actually provides water not just to that local community, but also to the capital city of Kenya, which I think is one of the greatest cities in Africa, or the greatest city of Africa, Nairobi. So I think that by taking that lead, that's something that we can all do as the current generation right now, and leading to the next generation is finding that thing within your community that you don't want to see eradicate or taken away
Hmm.
because it's so valuable to your ancestors, to your current now, and to also the future coming up. So really appreciate you for sharing that, and just would like to commend you again for the work that you're really doing for your community. and also kind of using the play on words Equi-Tea, which is when I saw that I was like, wow, this is genius. This is genius. Um, so, as we come
Thank
real
you.
close to this to our episode today, we close each episode with a segment we call for the founders, three for the founders, Blue Fi. Currently, my co-host not here with me. He's got some obligations to take care of. But for the founder segment, it's his place to reflect on something that's been grounding you, challenging you, or calling you forward. So the question is, I'll give you two of them. I'll take one of them. The question is, what's something that has been sitting with you lately, either from your work, your community, or your personal growth? And I'll start off by just saying, I think the one thing that's been sitting with me to reflect on this conversation we've had is I guess it's kind of based on economics, supply and demand. There's always going to be a demand for something, and you have to find the supply for it. So one of the things that I really just been sitting on and can say that I want to continue making the great effort on, and it's challenging me as well in terms of how to progress with it, from an organization point of view and an individual point of view, is just scaling to understand what is the short-term goal, what is a long-term goal, and what is the impact that we are trying to create. Because we've started doing the wetland restoration this year in February, and it's our first year. We've only been doing this for like the past 6 months, and we've had a lot of traction and a lot of engagement, which we didn't even expect. We just wanted to basically just start like monthly cleanups first, but now we've grown to kind of getting a global presence to where people are like, oh, okay, we actually are really, in support of this. So now, from thinking from that point of view of like, how do I continue scaling up? So we reflect into that. Um, it's something that's relative to the community I come from, and also my own personal growth of ensuring that I stay grounded to understanding that if I want justice to be done for this, it has to be done the right way and ensure that I continue progressing in that traction. So I'll give you the last two to take over here for the founders reflection and fire moment.
Well, yeah, the wetlands project sounds amazing. And I think sort of building off of that, I've also been thinking a lot about storytelling and how to frame the narratives, not just around tea, but also around like decolonial climate education as a whole, especially to people who might not be who might be more new to it or who might not be super accepting once they hear the term. So thinking about how to build a brand that is welcoming, but also very much rooted in our values and in our mission, and not really trying to separate people too much in the language that we're using. And then I guess the last thing would be um, how we can regenerate local economies in a way when the central government isn't very accepting or isn't really supportive. I think that's something that we're dealing with both in America and also in India in terms of building out the tea brand, because of both ends of the governments of both ends are being pretty avoidant to environmental action that is rooted in the community. So, how can we regenerate the local economies and rely on the local networks without the government support, essentially?
Well said. Shreya, just want to say thank you for sharing your voice, your vision, your heart. Your work is a reminder that, climate justice isn't just about emissions or electric vehicles or transportation. It's about land, language, and liberation. And as a final word, where can listeners, followers, kind of check out your work, support equity, or engage with your next steps of everything? Where can they check that out?
Yeah, for sure. Right now, we're very active on Instagram. My Instagram is at Shreya.Chaudhuri with two eyes. And then the Instagram for my nonprofit Project Planet is at projectplanet.world.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you for that. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us today. If this episode resonated with you, share it, tag us, keep it centering the stories that decolonize, restore, and reimagine the world. Also, make sure to go like, subscribe, comment, share it, everything, and check us out on the Alive Podcast Network to listen to other Black hosted and Indigenous hosted podcasts. So, without further ado, I'm Tex Wambui here, your host, and signing off here for today. So peace out, and we are the Voices of Change.